Very informative. Thank you, Cindy, Andrew, and Tanisha for the insight. And Cindy, I'm also looking forward to all of that as well. Up next, continuing our data track sessions, let's explore the advantages a single data repository has for all teams and departments in the modern law firm.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today's session. My name is Mandy Neske. I'm with Litera's Objective Manager team, and I'll be moderating today's session. I've really been looking forward to today's event, really excited about it. We have a really great group of panelists for you today, each bringing a lot of significant experience with them. And with that being said, we only have 45 minutes for our fun-filled, brilliant conversation. So with that, I want to give you guys a chance to get to know our panelists. Paul, did you want to maybe say hello and give us a little bit about your background?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Paul Devitt. For 30 plus years, more than I care to remember, I was an advisory lawyer. And within that period also, I had the great privilege to be managing partner of what was a national, then an international law firm. Revenue is about $230 to $250 million equivalent. And within that, I had the great challenge and pleasure of launching a strategy to help us overcome and prosper following the financial crisis. More recently was an executive partner in the UK at EY Law, helping found and progress that. And now I'm an executive coach and a board advisor, both to professional services partners and to tech companies.
Great, thank you. Amanda, did you want to tell us a little about yourself?
Sure. I'm Amanda Bakken, Director of Business Development at Stinson LLP. We're an AmLaw 200 firm based in the Midwestern United States. I reside in our Minnesota office, as you can tell by my accent. I can assure you it's less pleasant than the panelists from across the pond, but thanks for having me.
Great. Thanks for joining us today, Amanda. James, would you like to go next?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm James Lawson, Director of Customer Success for Litera, Objective Manager. My background is I've been in customer success now for over 20 years, ex-Oracle, boo, and now obviously working with Litera within the law tech industry with law firms.
Great. Thank you, James. And Richard.
Mandy, hello, everyone. Yeah, I'm Richard Punt. I spent most of my career at Deloitte, where I was managing partner first for strategy and planning, which hopefully will be relevant this morning, and then for clients and markets. I subsequently spent time at a law firm called Allen and Overy, launching a new business called Peerpoint and involved in their legal tech developments, and spent the last couple of years at a firm called Thomson Reuters that some of you Litera guys might have heard of. So that's me.
Yeah, great. Told you guys lots of great experience today. So with that, I'd like to just set the stage a little bit and, discuss how firms are planning today, right? What are you doing for your strategy planning? Amanda, do you want to maybe just give us some insight into what Stinson is doing today with their strategic planning process?
Sure. So every year we ask our partners to complete individual engagement plans or what they want to accomplish in the coming year. We used to have them complete these plans in Word documents, if you can believe that. That was years ago. Obviously, there are a lot of disadvantages to doing it that way. We often found that the attorneys would complete their plans, they would submit them, and then they would go stale on the shelf somewhere. Also, it's not easy to share those Word documents with others, and it's nearly impossible to search through those Word docs to find commonalities or collaboration opportunities. So we switched to an online tool called Objective Manager. We are still asking attorneys to complete and submit their plans at the beginning of every year. But now that plan stays top of mind for our attorneys because the platform allows for due date reminders that come into the attorneys' inboxes. And we also encourage attorneys to really do a global search of Objective Manager prior to pursuing any particular prospect, because understanding and leveraging the relationships among all of our colleagues is within that prospective client company we use that and it's very effective.
Yeah, absolutely. Having that, the visibility that technology can bring that simply you can't find in those disconnected Word documents, it's really can be a game changer. James, I know you work with, a lot of our firms and just your experience in general. What are you seeing being used just kind of throughout the platform from a planning perspective?
Yeah, so what you hear from Amanda is a great example of like driving that change through, because it's a cultural change, not just a change about process or bringing something into play. And really, the key to it with most law firms is creating adherence to plans. And what is the trigger? What's going to get the bite into? Well, whether I do this plan or not, the outcome is the same. And it's stepping out of that to bring some value in the execution of it itself. We see lots of firms look at things such as Porter's 5 Forces, using OKRs. There's the great book by John Doerr, Measure What Matters, Theory of Change. All of those kind of things are kind of brought into play with various customers as tools and resources. But ultimately, what we find with most customers is it's the leadership behavior and looking at the data that comes from those plans to drive the success. Interestingly, the customers who tend to kind of see plans as a sideline activity or one that doesn't necessarily need adherence, they tend to see that there's money left on the table and there's client experience, some doubts around the client's experience, despite the outcome. And so with these plans, success leaves clues, right? And if you can only manage what can be measured. So there's that element of it with most of our clients is becoming more popular because they're beginning to now look at the data and look at, well, actually, I understand what we made and how we did with our clients, but can you quantify that in terms of the activities and what was driving that success? And that's the beauty of strategic planning that we're seeing, increasing popularity at the moment.
Yeah, and absolutely managing what you can measure. I think that's, really, really a key point there. Paul and Richard, any thoughts around what you've been seeing from a planning perspective?
I'd accentuate a point which James made on the way through there. I think he mentioned modeling. I think there's an important point which is very, very adjacent to that, and actually alongside something which Seth mentioned in the introduction earlier today, not just role modeling, but the personal connection from leadership, which in my experience can get one of two pretty wildly differing reactions, maybe from the leadership and maybe from the people who are being connected with, from, oh my goodness, what is all this about? How long will this take? To, there's something here. Somebody is taking time to properly investigate and connect and try and understand what it's really like at the coalface or where I am, and what my clients' issues are and what my practice group's issues are. And that, I think, then when that translates into planning, can be really powerful, because one isn't simply saying, this is the plan, this is your goal, which aligns with the plan, but there's a conversation about the right behavior to execute, and also perhaps about some hurdles that need to be overcome, where the enterprise, the organization, the leadership need to provide some unblocking or some assistance. And I think to plan without recognition of the necessary areas for improvement can be a real challenge.
Absolutely. Okay. So as we look at, because, there are some firms today who are still dealing with the Word documents, right, that Amanda described, or, you might have a combination, right? You might have people who love the Word, people who love the Excel, you have, your PowerPoints, they want some pictures in their plans. So how did you successfully move from these kind of siloed or, disconnected plans into, a more unified planning process, with software. So I think that'd be great to kind of understand how you made that leap.
Sure, I'm happy to explain that. And I think it really boils down to three key factors. I would say the first would be ambassadors, the second would be education, and the third would be ease of use. And I'll talk a bit about each of those categories here as well. Ambassadors. So we really took a phased approach in our rollout of our online tool. First, we offered it to our practice leaders. We knew that they would be instrumental in encouraging our attorney population to use it. So we wanted them to feel like they were part of the decision. And because change is hard, we created solid talking points for them to use in overcoming objections that they might encounter along the way. In terms of education, we created training programs that address the importance of planning, as well as how to use the tool. And going back to some of Seth's comments, we wanted to explain the why it's important so that people felt inspired to create their plans. They didn't just feel like this was something that, our business development team or firm leadership is asking them to do. We wanted them to understand that there's a real reason and a real purpose for doing it. So that was our education. And then in terms of ease of use, we made it super easy for the attorneys to complete their engagement plans. And we did this a few different ways. First of all, we made accessing their plans super easy by offering that single sign-on link on the homepage of our firm portal. And we kept the plan template really simple. We only had 5 categories of questions so that it didn't feel overwhelming or really burdensome. And in that way, we're able to, really prioritize what they were working on. And then finally, we offered one-on-one sessions with our business development managers to really coach the attorneys on what they should put into the plan and how to put it into their plan. So ambassadors, education, and ease of use for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think ambassadors are key. And then also, what you mentioned is keeping it simple, right? I think people get really excited sometimes when they see technology and they want to put a lot of content in it, and they think, great, we have this software. Let's do a list of, 15 goals. But the problem is when you're really focused on strategic planning, you want to have a smaller number so that you can really keep that top of mind throughout the year and be successful, right? You want that real lasered in focus on your strategic goals. So absolutely keeping it simple is key so that it is successful. James, I want to come around to you again, because I know you see this a lot, and I know you talk about best practices and what you should think about when approaching planning. Anything that you'd like to add?
I mean, the one of the key things there Amanda mentioned was the phased rollout, because what you're doing there is trying to encourage good behaviours and habits within the law firm, and the simplicity element of it. A lot of it comes down to how you articulate the whole thing. So, from using planning to the plans itself to what's in the plans, the articulation of the importance of what they're doing is key. But what I see over and time again is the fact that these are kind of like the seeds that are going to plant the tree in which you're going to get the fruits of the labor from. So with these plans, again, coming back to the data conversation, to the session prior to this, there's a lot that can be learned from plans. And that's really, whether you're a solo lawyer or working as part of a team, you are going to want to know what's in your peripheral vision at all times. You're also going to want to know what all the outstanding questions, as a lawyer, you don't want to be caught out by those things, because you just don't. That's not in your nature. And so, and more so, you don't want people to be thinking those things. They may not be wanting to say them to you. Having a plan opens that up. And so, this is one of the things I get fed back a lot from managing partners is we're asking more questions now, but they're the right questions because we know what the plan is. And that's something that, that Stinson will reap the rewards on based on what they've rolled out.
And by the plan, James, you mean not just, and I think this is something which Amanda mentioned also, you mean not just the goals, but the context, the rationale behind the strategy and what the benefits will be and why, what clients want.
Yeah, exactly. So that effectively, you know, what clients want, but so that it's not just an exercise of following correlation, you know, causation and correlation are different things. So it's just so that the rationale behind it is that there is some tangible benefit for everybody involved in this process. And that's the thing, going back to the articulation of the message and how you market it and promote it, along, you know, with the firm strategy. I've heard some law firms not even realize that they're in the exercise itself because they've managed to market it in such a way that you're just following the firm strategy, and it doesn't. Often they lean on the financial side of that data to drive that, you know, to get that biting point. But there are other elements as well now that law firms will roll into, such as ESG, etc.
I want to give a pause to make sure I'm not going too fast for anybody. Perfect. So we recently released a paper with Dr. Heidi Gardner, closing the strategy to execution gap. And in that particular paper, it's discussed that a fundamental reason why there is a gap between plan creation and execution is that the firm members feel disconnected, you know, from those plans. So how do you foster that connection between the plan, you know, the firm plan and the actual, you know, partner's success? Richard, I'd love to get your thoughts on that one.
So a few thoughts on that, Mandy. I you know, the first part for me is that partners have to believe in the plan. They have to believe in the end goal. And they're not going to believe in it just because you communicate what it is, or even if you engage them in it. They have to be part of designing the end goal. And I find increasingly that is actually rare, and that leadership teams want to go off into a darkened room and work this out for themselves, maybe with some help of some consultants, and it won't work. You have to get the partners involved. The last time I put together the strategy for the UK firm, we involved 700 partners in the process. Now, did we get to a strategy that they all agreed with? No, of course we didn't. But they felt like they'd had input, and they could recognize that the themes that came out of it were broad consensus across the partners. So the first thing is that they've kind of got to be part of getting it together. The second thing is, and this seems like a ridiculous thing to say, but the plan has to reflect the goal. And this is partly, I think, to James's point that, you know, too many plans end up being entirely numbers driven. And it is rare for the strategy plan to be entirely numbers driven. So you have this gap immediately opened up, which is that all the partners and the units within which they're operating appear to be targeted on a set of financials. And the firm is talking about a wider set of strategic goals. And that doesn't work either. You know, you've got to be in a position where partners and the teams understand what contribution they're making to the strategy widely defined. And it doesn't mean that everybody's contribution is the same. And it might be that some partners are only there to deliver financial results, or that would be a bit unlikely. But there has to be clarity about where they are. The third bit is probably for me is the leadership behavior point that both Paul and James raised earlier. You know, the metrics and the management of performance are a factor here. But at the end of the day, partners behave according to the way that they see partly their leaders, but much more importantly, the people they see as their role models acting. And so thinking about how aligned strategic activity and behavior is celebrated within the organization, and just as important, that leaders find a way of indicating when things happen that would not align with strategy and that is a bad thing, is really important. Because, you know, we've all seen it happen, but if the people you think are really the best people in the firm are doing things in a certain way, everybody else follows. And so that whole issue of reinforcement of strategic behavior is critical. And then the fourth thing, you know, is really around compensation. So there has to be a direct link between compensation and the contribution that's made to the strategic plan. It can't be just about how much revenue you've built this year. It has to be about what broader contribution you've made to the strategic plan. We in Deloitte now, several years ago, we embarked upon a strategy of being focused on building major client relationships. And one of the consequences of that is that we reserved the top half of the point system in the partner process to people who were leading major relationships. It didn't matter how much of your own billings you had. You could be the highest biller in the firm. You could not get into the top half of the partnership without being responsible for a major relationship on behalf of the firm. And that kind of mechanism changed behavior pretty quickly to cause people to behave. So I think there's, the compensation bit ultimately is very important, and you've got to get those tied together. But that has to be linked to, having a plan that really counts, and having a set of behaviors that continue to be reinforced about what is good and what is not so good about what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. 700, that's just a small sampling that you worked on to get some input, huh?
Just 700. A lot of workshops.
I'd echo all of those points made by Richard there. That the proper involvement of partners in deciding upon the strategy, some commonalities as far as you can get it, about what is the opportunity you're trying to take, or what are the problems you're trying to solve. Those big picture directive questions is crucial. People, and not least because leadership don't have all the answers, and they don't know all of what's going on in the firm, even though they may pretend that that's the case. But then also back to the point I made earlier when Amanda and James were talking about the importance of personal connection for the leadership with those partners. For me, not just, and from my experience, not just at the time one is setting the strategy and the plan which fits with the strategy, but continuing from that. One of the things I did when I was CEO managing partner, I only had 120 partners to cover, Richard. It was a cakewalk. Was twice a year, sit down with each of those partners. So that was pretty full, 3 to 4 weeks, twice a year. So what was that about? It was about, to borrow something from Seth earlier, but seeing them, paying some respect to them and their knowledge and input, learning them, being curious about what I might learn, but also, and the sessions were billed this way, I'd like to talk to you about your thoughts about the strategy and what you can contribute. So people would come along knowing that was the conversation. And immediately there's a reinforcement, and it doesn't seem an odd thing to bring up. There's a pulse in the organization that you talk about these things regularly, not just every 3 years when you set it. And okay, there was a bit of eye rolling of, oh God, another conversation with him. But actually, there became a continuing conversation which developed the goals.
Yeah, and I think that conversation, again, it ties that personal investment to it, which also I think helps drive that success. I know Amanda and I were talking about some particular pieces in this paper, and there was a particular area that I know she drew a lot of parallels with, and why Stinson has had so much success with their planning program. Amanda, did you want to share that?
Yeah, Amanda, as you know, I'm a huge fan of Heidi Gardner and obviously collaboration in general. But in reading through the article, I think it's page 10, there's a table on there titled Snapshot of Responsibility by Role. And I think we've talked a bit about, how the plan gets created and who is there to help create the plan. But I think the part about execution is so incredibly important. And I think, if you look down the sections relating to the responsibilities of those that are the subunit heads, and the responsibility of those who are the smart collaboration facilitators, and those individual partner responsibilities. And I just have to say, so I lead our team of business development managers, and they were really critical in helping with the execution of this. They were the subunit heads. they were the folks who were clearly outlining the new responsibilities and assigning accountability and keeping our plan top of mind so that people knew what the next steps were, how we were changing so that we could accomplish what was in the new strategic plan. And I just think that, recognizing the role, everybody's individual role throughout the organization, and showing appreciation and making sure that they're all involved and all, part of the plan.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll add, I know one thing that we've heard a lot of feedback from some of our planning users is that when you share something, right, when you share a goal, when you share a plan and it becomes visible in public, of course, there's drive to make that successful. But also, some of the feedback we would hear is that partners wouldn't have visibility to what the firm goals actually were, right? Mm-hmm. So when you actually can have that firm plan shared in public, and they can see the goals and they can see the updates and they can see people, taking action, even just that visibility, I think really helps with the connection as well, to know, right, what does my firm want to be successful at? How can I help drive that success? What are they doing? So I think visibility is just as key, I think, from having that that personal connection to it.
Visibility, Mandy, I completely agree with that. And consistent language. There will be some key themes within any strategy or plan, and repetition and consistent use of the concepts. It then becomes a powerful code in the organization for what people are trying to achieve.
Absolutely. James, I didn't want to skip you. Any thoughts?
No, I mean, it's really, as Richard, with his 3 points, like the combination of the relationship, the compensation, the plan itself. And Paul, it's interesting you having those conversations, because it made me think, well, what happens if some of these guys aren't on the bus from the beginning? Do you find a way of aligning them to the plan? Do they realize that they may have some skills there that can contribute to the plan? And that's where that relationship is absolutely fundamental to the whole thing being executed. I think firms recognize if they have strong leaders, or leaders that perhaps require some development in some way. But I think a lot of the time that comes out a lot through this exercise. And I think it's those plans that excite and galvanize, that they'll only happen if those 3 elements are there to fuel them, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, kind of going back to visibility, when you do have visibility, whether it's, again, sharing your goals or sharing a plan, I think with visibility naturally comes some accountability. So I'm curious, what is your philosophy on accountability in these business plans, in these strategy plans? In other words, how do you really keep the team focused on those key strategic goals so that they have this brilliant plan, that it actually does go to execution, right? They put in the effort to create this plan. They did the research. You've spoken with the team. You've had these meetings. How do you ensure that they essentially go that last mile, right? So they do see success.
I mean, I can offer you a sort of a rather simple answer to that, which for me, this is just about leadership. The question of accountability for business plans is really not a question that should come up. If you have a challenge in getting accountability, then I'm pretty confident you have the wrong leaders. One of the things from my experience in partnerships, whether that's in my old weird Big Four world or with law firms, is that most partners desperately want somebody to lead them. They desperately want to be pointed in the right direction. And the confusion comes when nobody's doing that, and when somebody is attempting to corral opinion and create consensus, because it's not possible. And that, what partners really want is they want to feel like they've inputted and contributed to the process, but they know where they're going, and somebody's taking accountability for that direction. they're not that different from humans in all sorts of other walks of life. And I think that the challenge for the top teams in firms is to be incredibly robust about the need for high quality leaders across the firm. And it's a hackneyed thing to say these days, but causing your top biller to be the leader of the unit is not a good idea very often. They're not necessarily the people who are best at leading the teams, but you see it time and time and time again as the way forward. And so I think this whole question of accountability is a pretty simple one. At the end of the day, it's about having people who want to lead the team and want to get there, and will find ways of going the extra mile. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to deliver on the plan every time. And I come from a culture where missing the plan was not a bad thing, because we set very brave, aggressive plans. There are plenty of organizations who do the opposite, which is a real problem to miss the plan, because the plan was set in an incredibly conservative way. So you have to decide where you are on that risk spectrum. And this is not about ultimately what the outcomes are, but about the way in which people set about getting there is a leadership question for me.
Yeah,
and developing.
I definitely
that,
agree. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, Mandy. I was just going to develop what Richard said. So I agree with that. And then what does that mean? How does it manifest itself? And there are some key elements, I think, which go to ensuring accountability across the organisation or across the partnership group. Some of them we've mentioned already. The role modelling of leadership behaviour, if that's not aligned with the strategy and the necessary behaviours, don't confuse the strategy and the behaviours with the target, but if that's not aligned, there's no chance that people will get with it if the leaders aren't role modelling it. And then there's a discipline there of consistency of message, of focus, of repetition, even though it might seem a little bit boring. One of the things I struggled with was a fear of patronising members of the firm, bunch of bright people, if I repeated things too often. I now know I could not have repeated things too often. Not because people aren't intelligent and smart, but because they're busy, they're doing other stuff. And if you can help them with that consistency and clarity, it can go a long way.
Absolutely. Richard, and I think that goes to the point you were saying earlier, Paul, when you were talking about using consistent language in the plans.
Yeah.
Right? It's that same repetition.
Yeah. And being consistent with reward and recognition and celebration, not just of financial results, which was one of Richard's points earlier. And my last point in this section is, I think if leadership can provide the higher view, the overview, perhaps some insights, there'll be loads of data. There'll be targets and KPIs, there'll be dashboards. All of those are helpful. But if you can try and get beyond that, try and get to a level of understanding which develops you further, then there can be some real gold dust. I mean, one of the things which occurs to me there was at EY, we were very good at planning and tracking our pipeline of what new work, and that gave great business visibility, really helped business planning in terms of what the financial results would likely to be, and therefore what investment could be. But there was another level there when we got beyond it. If we said, well, okay, we know we're winning X% of every opportunity, but why are we winning? And one question was, do we win more if we go to market with colleagues and collaborate and are taken along, or do we not? And the result was astonishing. When we went alone as single unit lawyers, we didn't do badly. We won about a third of the opportunities. When we were introduced by and taken along and went as an integrated team with colleagues, we won 9 out of 10 opportunities.
Yeah.
Suddenly everybody goes, wow, But I think that there's some leadership input there, Richard, into the kind of questions you should ask to get the right data.
Yeah, and I think just on that point about data and where you want the leaders focused, you want them focused on the market and what clients are saying about demand and the kinds of things that really matter. So that's a really interesting metric. It's one actually Alan Novi has a very similar model where they've proved to their partners that it's the international network that drives profitability. If you get more than 3 offices in an engagement, you make more money, and that's been consistently demonstrated by them. But it's also, I think, the purpose of leadership, part of what they have to be doing is saying, how are we doing relative to the state of the market? If we're performing really well, is that because all boats are rising on the tide, or is it because we are taking share? We've got a situation right now where there are not many law firms having a bad time of it. This is a pretty good time to be a law firm. But, I was working with a firm last week who are not doing as well as the rest of the market. They're doing okay, but compared to where they are. And, they have a managing partner who's prepared to call that because he can see what's happening out there in the market. And I think just back to this whole question on data, whether it's in planning or in execution, the thing that leaders have to bring to the table is the market. Someone said to me that their planning process had previously been unencumbered by fact. And most planning processes tend to be massively over-encumbered by internal data sets, and there isn't sufficient from the outside. And I think continually leaders have to be pushing on what is the market looking like. And that means that those roles have to be very client engaged. They can't be internal process roles.
That's what I was going to ask of you, Richard, Amanda, and James, the extent to which regular client conversations inform the plan and the goals.
Yeah, I think we're definitely seeing, I would say, more of a focus on client relationships. A lot of firms will have their own internal team now that will perform, client feedback. How are we doing? How can we help you grow? How can we be better in the coming year? And whether that's done, again, with, someone internally who has that role within the firm, or whether they'll work with an external consultant to do that. There is a lot of value in getting, again, that client feedback. And often what they'll do is, once you have your client go through this exercise, right, you're having them invest time with you, it's taking that feedback, and we're actually seeing people make those as part of their key client goals, right? So the client said this, we want to take that, make it a smart, measurable goal that's now visible and we can take action on. So I think we're definitely seeing that becoming part of the planning process.
And I guess
Sorry,
Richard, go.
One of the things just back to this point and the way that planning processes come together, I think it's very important for leadership to be capable of providing a top-down view on where they think the focus needs to be. So, there's a lot of this conversation, which I agree with, which is about having strong bottom-up engagement of the partners, but there also has to be a view on where the best opportunities are. That can be that often, I think, most firms engage in that, but it's often engaged in very broad strokes. It's this sector or it's this whole practice group. And I think what's incredibly valuable here is to get down a level and be much more granular about where those opportunities are and where you're prepared to put investment behind, and to think about which bits of the business are going to be, perfectly good parts of the business, very profitable, but pretty steady, and which areas could really drive growth with the right kind of investment. And of course, that has to come from those partner groups themselves. But leadership also has to be in a position to make a judgment as to whether what's coming up is right. There are definitely cases where teams will not put forward the right level of ambition for the kind of markets they're in. And so that top-down to bottom-up feature of this is very important.
Yeah. I also want to circle back. Amanda had mentioned in one of our early sessions here that as part of the planning process, she encourages her team to use, the universal search feature, right? And that's something where, there's no magic, unless Word has released it and I'm not aware, right? But there's no magic paper button so that you can identify where that overlay or those synergies are so that you can, go in with the team, and then expand the number of practice groups that are serving a client, right? So being able to look and I think that's something that's really critical is, the firm's greatest asset is their attorneys, right? It's their expertise, it's their knowledge base. And when you can start looking across all of those plans and start having the collaboration and introductions come, I think that's really, really an important piece as well. Amanda, did you want to, did I get that right?
Well, I'll just add to that, Mandy, in addition to the firm's greatest asset being our attorneys, it's also the relationships that we have. It's relationships with our clients, it's relationships with other attorneys, it's internal relationships among our staff. And I think, when we went into this virtual environment, everyone is saying, how did you stay collaborative environment? How did you stay in touch with each other? And I think, my answer to that is that we really didn't have to shift gears much. I mean, for years now, we've been encouraging attorneys to utilize Objective Manager for that collaboration, to understand the relationships that we have, with other prospective clients and within each other. And so, Objective Manager was really a catalyst for helping us to stay connected, through this pandemic and through this virtual work environment. And so, I feel like we're, sort of ahead of the curve with a lot of firms in terms of, really staying in touch and continuing to build on those relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. Having that visibility, I think, and seeing, just having the opportunities for collaboration visible there, right? Oh, you're going after this particular client. I know that person. Let's connect, right? So just having that easy way, again, as I said, to connect the dots, I think really does break down those silos, right? Let's have that collaboration start working. So we know how you guys didn't necessarily have to pivot too much, right? With the new hybrid, because you already had that technology in place. I guess Richard and Paul, what are you guys seeing just kind of out there as far as how our firms pivoting with the fact that you're not having the conversation, walking back from the office, or from the courthouse? How are you seeing, people really work to keep collaboration and those conversations going?
I mean, shall I go, Paul? My take on this is, I think you have to recognize that collaboration is not by definition going to happen just because you're in the office. And I think firms tend to, this is wild generalization, firms tend to overstate the amount of effective collaboration there is within their organizations. And actually, I think maybe partly in the way Amanda's describing, what we've all just been through for the last 18 months is starting to cause people to think very hard about how they structure the way they work to promote collaboration where that is valuable. By the way, sometimes it isn't valuable, but when it is valuable, and how you make that happen. And I think firms are really at the early stages of thinking about that. There's a huge amount of discussion, dialogue, thinking going on to the extent to which firms are going to insist or are insisting on their people being back in the office for a certain amount of time or not. And that's as much about managing partners and COOs being worried about real estate standing empty than it is about what's the best way to work. And I think we're only just starting to see firms really think about what collaboration means in this environment. One of the things that I'll finish to close on this. One of the things that always strikes me about law firms relative to my old world is that in this whole question on collaboration, there is one venue that law firms don't pay much attention to, and that is being at the client. So, I've spent my entire career providing services in the client's building with my team members. Whereas in law firms, that is much rarer, and it's much more likely that you would be in your own offices or now at home. And I think that's something that firms really should think about as they emerge again into the real world. How can they spend more time as teams collaborating in and with their clients?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, we have, just, I think, 40 seconds left. I could chat with you guys for another 45 minutes. So thank you so much for making this just such a great session. I appreciate all of your input, you being part of, the Changing Lawyer Summit today. And, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mandy. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Mandy. Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Such great info. Thank you to our entire panel there. Now, continuing on, we'll now explore how firms can deliver legal project management and pricing at scale, ensuring all the moving parts stay aligned during that process.
And there we are.
Hello.
Hello. Hi, Jessica.
Hi.
Hello, everyone. My name is Peter van der Hoeven. I'm co-founder of Clocktomizer, which is now part of Litera. And this session is about the benefits of having a single source of truth for pricing and legal project management, and how to create that single source of truth. And in the next half hour, I have the pleasure and honor of speaking with Jessica Davis. She's a director of Matter Performance and Service Innovation at McCarter & English, and celebrated speaker and panelist. Jessica, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today.
Hello. The pleasure is all mine. I enjoy all of our chats.
That's amazing. I mean, we've just seen the session from the team of Objective Manager talking about a single source of truth. Before that, we had Foundation talking about a single source of truth. We're really going to round it all up today and talk about single source of truth for pricing and legal project management. So this is a live session. So not only a warm welcome to you, Jessica, but also a warm welcome to all of our attendees. And if you have any questions, that's the beauty of a live session. Feel free to post them in the chat channel on the right-hand side of your screen. So a little bit later during our session, we'll actually make time for some Q&A, and I'd love to have some questions from the audience. So please make sure that they're concise, very pasteable onto the screen, and we'll just try to pretend that we're Seth Godin as he did earlier today. So, to Jessica, for now, we've heard about the single source of truth being so important for law firms, but let's take a step back, right? How would you describe or define a single source of truth, and how is it so useful?
Yeah, so for me, I see a single source of truth as a shared framework or approach, shared language, and shared metrics. So I think that often, especially when you're dealing with collaboration internal to an organization, some of the breakdown or the friction that you encounter isn't because of misalignment of incentives. That can be the case, but often everyone is really trying to do the best for the organization, and it's just we aren't really on the same page when we're talking about how we approach things, or we're not speaking the same language or measuring with the same yardstick. So I feel like if we can make sure that we're in alignment on those things, and even you can expand that to include a process for disagreement and resolution. But if we're alignment on those things, I think you can really get into that high performing team dynamic. And then the other part of it is, I think, transparency. So making sure that all of those things, like once you've agreed to them, they're stored in a centralized place and they're accessible to a cross section of people. And I'm of the mindset that I like to define stakeholders as like everybody who can impact or thinks that they may be affected or is affected. That's really broad. And so I try to make sure that there's as much transparency as possible, because I found that uncertainty is really one of the things that can hinder collaboration and just high performance generally. So there are things, having complete certainty in everything is impossible, but where it's possible to have some certainty, I think it's really helpful.
And I love how actually all of these sessions of today are kind of coming back to, because we're all thinking about a single source of truth being like, we need all the data in one database or something. But it's so interesting to hear everybody actually say, well, a lot of it is not necessarily only the data, it's really, are we singing from the same hymn sheet, right? Are we sharing that language? And when we were talking about this before, I also realized that this is something that actually we do when implementing software, right? We align on how we talk about things. Are we talking about recovery rates? Are we talking about realization rates? How are these calculated? If you don't do those kind of things, it becomes impossible to tackle issues, right? If and when they arise. So I'm 100% with you on the shared language, and you're saying, right, that central data set, it's just not the only thing that is important.
It's not the only thing. It is very important, particularly when you're trying to modernize a law firm or a law practice. But you can have a data set that's centralized, but if you don't have an alignment in terms of how you're even interpreting that data, people can use it to just actually undermine each other instead of rowing in the same direction.
Yeah, and I think that's so important. So let's say that we have all our processes aligned. We have our definitions synced, so to say, and I would hand you a magic wand to bring the firm's data together. What would your ideal data stack look like? Where would you start?
Well, I definitely, if Clocktomizer is offering magic wands that do that, sign me up.
we tried to productizing a crystal ball, but that hasn't yet materialized. So maybe we just pivot into the magic wands. But I'm afraid you have to stick to Harry Potter for that for now. But assuming it.
Right. Okay, so I have my Clocktomizer magic wand, and I'm going to start with financial information, because I think that that's something that across all law firms, we usually have that because we want to make sure that we're billing effectively. And so inside your financial information, you'll have a lot of really helpful data. It will include who did what, when, how long they spent doing it, and hopefully you'll have some sort of like task codes or something like that. You may have additional information like area of law or practice group that would be helpful. So once you have that information, then you can start integrating it with some of the other sources of information that you may have. I personally think you can start internal and then work with external as well. So the next step could possibly be your HRIS system. Often we're being asked to provide demographic information, not just who we hired or who is employed by our firm, but clients are increasingly asking who's working on my matters and how much are they working on my matters. So being able to link your HRIS system to your financial system and that information, I think, is really helpful. And this is also specifically when you're talking about HRIS, it's so important to have that collaboration there because this is highly sensitive information. And so you want to make sure that you're talking to a lot of different stakeholders about how you move this information to where you need it and how it's going to be used. And then another category of internal information that you could possibly pull together is stuff related to the actual legal engagement. I save this category for last because it's often not particularly structured, or it's not in a place where it'll be easy for you to just sync up with the rest of your data, but it can be really useful and it can be game changing. It could possibly exist in someone's actual office in a Redwell, in just paper. But you can get things like, let's say you're dealing with someone who does a lot of construction work. You may have different types of contracts or specific vendors. Perhaps they represent one big company that contracts out with a bunch of different people. We may be able to learn lessons from, like, if that's the people that we're working with, or if that's the type of work that they're going to be contracting, we can either measure something, how much it's going to cost, level of effort, etc. Then you can link it to the external information. So I'm really using this magic wand.
I can see, and you're doing an awesome job at it, right? And so it's actually amazing that you bring up the diversity part of it, right? Is it something that you do see more often? So you see clients are asking more. Is it part of a client engagement or outside counsel guidelines? What do you see in terms of development around data that you need to provide from a diversity and an inclusion perspective?
Yeah, so it's definitely in RFPs, pitches, proposals, and we're also getting direct requests. So specifically, they're trying to hold their vendors accountable. And we also get things like sustainability requests. So kind of when you're viewing your client, they have their corporate goals and objectives, and they have some expectations for their vendors. And depending on the size of your organization, it doesn't matter, if you're a law firm or you're the people who sell them their pens, they have some expectations for their suppliers. And so, yeah, we're getting those types of requests in all different ways and with increasing frequency.
Yeah, and it makes sense, right? There's a lot of talk about building sustainable supply chains, and this is a part of that, I would say. And interestingly, there's actually a talk coming up on today's the Changing Lawyer Summit about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So stay tuned. We will move back a little bit with our magic wand to the pricing and legal project management area, because let's say you're a pricing director or another professional or partner working in pricing. How do you benefit from this magically put together set of data?
So I find that it's really useful because you can analyze the data to identify salient characteristics that could impact either price or timeline or performance. And it depends on exactly what you're trying to measure. But you can identify if it has foreign language requirements or a certain number of foreign language requirements, or it's in a particular venue, particularly once you start plugging in with those external resources like litigation metrics or market data or regulatory events, you can really start to predict things. So one example is in the past, we were looking, it wasn't at this firm, it's actually a different firm, but we were looking at patent prosecution, and we realized through our data analytics that the number of inventors in a patent can actually impact the cost of how much it would, how much effort it would take for us to make sure that we secure that patent on behalf of our client. And that's something that we got through data analytics. And then we went and we validated that with our internal data and also the practitioners. And it bared out to be true.
I love this example. You know why? Because it's the number of inventors is actually something that you can, with quite a bit of work, but you can extract that from existing data sources, right? It's just in the patent filing, it's this line that you need to parse, because I think that's what we need to think about, right? What is the possibility? Which sources can we actually access? I've heard many times, can we not figure out how many depositions we did? But turns out it's really hard to surface that data, which then makes it really hard to leverage that for pricing purposes. You can do it maybe on a scale of 3 to 4, maybe 10 matters, but doing that on hundreds or thousands of matters is just really, really hard work. So I like it, think about where those sources sit, and then, use it for pricing, for actually, but making yourself competitive in the market. I like that.
Right, exactly. And this is a plug for additional collaboration, because a lot of those resources, and even if you talk to your KM people, some of the things that your firm already owns can be hooked up via API, where you can get some of that data without, like you said, having a huge data initiative where you start trying to collate it yourself.
Yeah, and that's actually where I wanted to go, because it may sound so daunting, right, to hook up all of that data. So I thought maybe we can think and talk about how we can maybe uncover data points that are already existing in other parts of the firm that may be unknowingly or passively collected. How would you go about it? How do you surface those kind of things that may not be within your own realm, so to say?
Yeah, I am a big fan of just talking to people. So I love initiating conversation or collaboration very early on. I kind of see my interactions in the professional world to be a little bit like you would if you were networking for, a sales job. If I have something, maybe I'm working on something that I think maybe even slightly tangentially related to somebody else, I may just send them an FYI email, forward something that I sent to somebody else and be like, hey, FYI, this is something that I'm working on. I don't know if it has anything to do with what you're working on, but just wanted to let you know you're invited if you want to sit in and listen, or if you have something to contribute. And I found that even when people are like, oh, no, that's fine, like that's not really in my wheelhouse, but maybe we can talk about it so I can learn more about what you do, like that is even a win. And then sometimes they're like, actually, we have this initiative that has this data that would plug in nicely. So that's what I think is key.
Yeah, and it's when you talk to people, I think there's different. I have no idea. I'm not a biologist or anything, but I think there's different. Your brain starts to work differently, and it's making connections and associations that you wouldn't make if you were just on your own sitting and thinking. And it's nice if you talk about things, you hear what people are struggling with, and if you share that, you can all of a sudden also, and I think that's what Seth Godin said as well, right? If you don't open up, you're not really connecting. And if you're not really connecting, you're not learning and finding ways that you can help maybe someone because you are sitting on that data. So right. It's really sharing about those things that will help you get better at it. And yeah, talking about different systems, there's a whole bunch of stories I could go with. But before I get into that, I think it's actually good for that to remind people that there's still room to ask questions. We're live, so if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the comments chat on the right hand side of your screen, and we can talk about them in just a minute. I think that's worthwhile. We have Jessica here now. I mean, how often do you get that opportunity? Not that often. But so let's talk a little bit again about data, right? And singing from the same hymn sheet, it reminds me of a process I've ran at Clocktomizer, actually, where we were invoicing and using two linked systems for it, one for tax, one for administration. And we invoiced on the first day of the month. But I'm actually sitting in Utrecht in the Netherlands, close to Amsterdam, which has a 9-hour time zone difference with the US West Coast, where the tax reporting system was based. So turned out that when I submitted an invoice at the end, or at midnight on the first day of the month, it was still last month on the West Coast in the US. So all of a sudden, my Q3, my October reports didn't match what I had in my system with what was on the tax system. And again, this is something where I think, having aligned on definitions, having aligned on what data you're looking at, it's just so important.
Yes, that's a fantastic example. We have similar things here as well. And again, that's one of the reasons why I think really broadening the tent to include people who they may not be the ones who are performing legal engagements or pricing or managing the legal work, but they know the systems really well. And they could have possibly flagged that for you earlier on. Another example, like specifically within the LPM pricing relationship, is sometimes when a pricing team may be talking directly with like the in-house counsel, they may be pricing or scoping. And let's say, for example, you have like 3 motions to dismiss. We anticipate 3 motions to dismiss. By the time it comes to my team for us to track that information, we may not be able to report back the way that pricing has structured the budget if we don't have those conversations early on. For multiple reasons, but like one example is if we're going to use task codes, there isn't really separate task codes for separate motions to dismiss. They all kind of fall into the same bucket. But we can have, if we're engaged with setting up the templates or engaged in those conversations, we can flag some of these things early on. And I've also seen where the in-house counsel, once they hand that pricing over to the legal operations team, they actually come back with some of the same criticisms and critiques that we do. So I think it also is one of the things, you can't think of your client as a monolith.
There's so many examples, right, where just having that communication lines open is just paramount to getting to a good result. And we talked about shared language, but we've also talked about data and data quality, and that is the lines, right? And a big challenge I see for many firms is, how do we keep our data clean? How do we keep our data quality high? And what sort of initiatives would you recommend from your experience to keep data as good as possible?
Yeah, I think you have to start with really thinking about your process and being very honest about the culture of your organization. So something that works in one place may not work in another. And also, people may be open to putting in a certain level of effort in one context, but not in another. So one of the things that I think is important is figure out, like, maybe it's at the point of time entry, you may be requesting a certain amount of information, or at the point of file opening, you may request certain information because there's an incentive to do that, right? There's an incentive to get your file open so you can start billing. You can start questioning, is this something that's self-reported? Or is there an external data source that we can use? Will we validate this by a subject matter expert? These are all kind of questions that you may have. So one example of where you may use an external data source is if you have industries, if you want to make sure that you are capturing your client industries, perhaps you start out in an external source that codes those, and then you validate internally by a subject matter expert. The key to scaling is really trying to make sure that you have as few errors as possible at the outset built into your process, and then validating that with hopefully your throughput error rate isn't too high and it doesn't take too much of a lift. Another thing is if you have the ability to influence the culture, really encouraging everyone to view themselves as a data steward. It truly is important for everybody to see the benefits of what you're doing and to understand that we all play a part. So, you may be frustrated entering your time, but if you enter your time correctly in the future, I can give you that spot on price that you've been asking for and trying to make that pitch as well. And
would you agree then with it, because it sounds like a lot like garbage in, garbage out, right? It's that what we hear a lot about when we talk about data.
It's even worse than garbage in, garbage out, I think, because it's garbage in, garbage out, but then over time, it just gets worse. So it's more like garbage in, garbage out, and then you make a photocopy of it, and then a photocopy of that photocopy.
For anyone who knows what a photocopier
I've aged myself. I've dated myself.
I know, but let's say that you scan it, right, and then you take a scan of another screen and another. But I think everyone gets that. But it's right. But so where would you do your checks? So you have like a myriad of applications, right? And I know that there's initiatives where people just go through all the data and they don't have magic wands, unfortunately. And they just have to go. So where do you hook in those quality processes to get the maximum output, the best output?
So I think it's really important to take a look, map out your whole journey, and identify the point where you can get the biggest bang for your buck. It really kind of depends on where you are also in selling or pitching your initiative. So it could be that at the beginning of pitching your initiative, you may be doing something really manually because you don't have the technology in place or the allocated resources, and you have to show that there is an ROI for this so that you can get them to invest in what you're doing. That shouldn't be where you stay, though. So hopefully you're really successful and you've demonstrated the value. Then you really should start to think, where can we best position this checkpoint or a tweak in the process in order to really scale.
And in scaling, I'm listening and trying and processing it as we speak. You said people need to be a data steward, right? Would you always recommend explaining why you're collecting certain data? Or do you think that, if people know what you're collecting the data for, that could skew the data because people would manipulate it on entry?
I think that it really depends on your organization and your culture. But one of the good things about transparency is that people will be policed, essentially. People will police others. People will police themselves. They will try to be honest if they know that everything is kind of out there in the open. I'm a big fan of transparency, and I'm a big fan of explaining to people why we're doing what we're doing. And you do have to keep an eye out for people who are trying to game the system. That does happen, but it's one of those things where someone's always going to try to game the system, regardless of how perfect your platform is or how perfectly you think you've outlined everything. So shining a bright light, I think, really helps to deter that type of behavior.
Yeah, and it's probably, if we want to keep it simple, right, it's about doing the right thing. And then the right thing, I would say, is quite obvious. You tell people what you're collecting and why and what you're using it for. So I did get a question from the audience. And that question is, what types of data are proving to be most beneficial for a firm's BD initiatives? Thanks, Damien, for asking.
Yeah, so I really think you can do a lot with BD initiatives using your financial information. So even if you don't have some of the other things that we're talking about, you can take a look at cross-selling between different practice groups. You can take a look at clients where maybe it's a really profitable client or it's a really good client by whatever metrics you use in your law firm. And then looking in your data set to see if there were any other clients that are similar or with a similar situation. And this is where you may, if you aren't very sophisticated with all of the data that you have integrated, you may need to do a little bit of extra research outside of your existing platforms to see kind of market trends, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that you can definitely start there. Another way is, like I mentioned, you can look at industries and identify things that perhaps can be done really well at scale. And then you can also look internal to one client. So perhaps when you look at a client, you're seeing, oh, well, this particular pocket of work has grown significantly over time. Is there anything that we can do to really target expanding that even more? How do we pour gas on that? How do we make it more profitable for us? And also maybe the client wants predictability. And so we can capture more work that perhaps they're handing out to other clients or other firms to make it more hours, get a bigger slice of that pie.
Awesome. And that actually leads me to the next thing, because we've also, we're talking about a single source of truth so that we can scale our operations, whether that's BD, so whether that's pricing, whether it's legal project management. So what would be your starting point to scale the pricing and legal project management process?
Oh, that's a hard question because I think that it's very specific to where you are and like what the appetite is at your organization. So I think if I were going to, and what I have done, if I'm going to a situation where it's just like blue sky, pick wherever you want to start, I like to try to keep my ear to the ground to identify pain points that people are having and constantly have an eye towards where can I actually have a return on that activity as soon as possible. So that could be something like, budget tracking, which depending on what platforms you have available, that could be either really easy or really hard. But you could possibly redeploy some of your existing systems to help with something like that. So you could use a lot of organizations that are on, Microsoft have SSRS, and you could build something that perhaps helps you kick things off. And then once you start to show that by surfacing or keeping an ay on this information, it's helpful, you can then make the pitch to get an external resource like, we have Cocktimizer. I like it, but because it makes it really easy. You can set things up and then look for that automation. So I think that's really the key. Whatever you end up doing after you can lobby to get some technology resources behind it, really automate.
And talking about automation, right? And we also talked about finding the highest impact point where you can correct data, but that also, doesn't that then eliminate jobs further down the line? If you're getting rid of so much manual work, don't you think that you're actually putting people out of a job?
So my personal philosophy is that I just don't create those jobs to begin with. So I'm always looking for opportunities to use technology and leverage technology, because I don't think it's economical for the firm. So I think it's just, especially if we already have a platform that perhaps I can redeploy for another purpose. So just being really creative as well. Already that helps the bottom line. But also, I don't think it's good for the personal and professional development of those people who have those jobs, because you're not really setting them up to succeed. I'd rather create a job that allows people to work with creating and implementing those technology solutions, because that's something that I think is a skill that they can really use and build on for the rest of their career.
I like that. And well, there's one question. We have to be quick because I think we have like 1 minute left. But what is your best practice with being proactive to make sure items do not fall through the cracks? Do you find emailing an attorney directly a good idea, or using software to get your status update on these kind of things? I think that relates to talking about budgets or and similar things. What's your thought?
I use emailing attorneys very judiciously. I think that they can get fatigued if they get too many communications, but I will maybe get a lot of communications. So I do use software to give me status updates. And then there are some attorneys who will get direct status updates. But then I also put in a little extra effort if there's something that I think is particularly important that I don't want to fall through the cracks, or where I think that there's added value in me synthesizing information from a bunch of different places. And I do make that outreach. I would hesitate to say emailing an attorney specifically, just because not all attorneys like to interact via email. So that's one where I would take a page out of the attorney's book and really follow what they like. So I have some attorneys who they rather if I just send them a quick email and say, hi, do you have 5 minutes to talk about X? And they'd like to just talk through it as opposed to me just sending them an email.
I like it. Who likes emails, right? And actually, talking about the future of work, who likes running through Excel sheets for hours, days, weeks in a row? I don't think there's many people. And talk much more on the future of work actually later today in a session with Richard Zuskind led by Haley Altman. Stay on for that. It's going to be an amazing session. And we're out of time. Thank you so much, Jessica, for joining me today. This has been an amazing opportunity to learn from you. And I would say just thank you. That was so amazing.
I always love our chat, so I'm looking forward to the next.
So do I.
You take care.